I always believed life had a way of balancing out, of making things right, but as I stood there in that cold, dimly lit room, staring at the evidence of betrayal, I realized I had been wrong. Everything I thought I knew was a lie, and the people I loved most were the ones who shattered my world. My sister, Becky, and my cousin, Regina, their betrayal was almost too much to bear. But let me start from the beginning. Growing up, I was the responsible one. The oldest daughter in a family that prided itself on appearances, I was always the one to keep things together. My parents, Debbie and Carl, were strict but loving. They expected the best from me, and I worked hard to live up to their standards. Becky, on the other hand, was the wild child. She was 3 years younger than me, and from the moment she could walk, she was trouble. I tried to protect her, even when she didn't want it. Our bond was complicated. We loved each other, but there was always an undercurrent of rivalry. Becky had a way of making you feel like you weren't good enough. She was always more charming, more daring, and she never cared about the consequences. Our parents turned a blind eye to her reckless behavior, excusing her antics with a she's just young mentality. I envied her freedom, but I never let it show. I was the dependable one, the one they could count on to make good decisions. Regina, my cousin, was more like a sister to me than a cousin. We were inseparable growing up. She lived just a few blocks away, and we spent almost every day together. She was quieter than Becky, more calculated. While Becky was loud and in your face, Regina was subtle and sneaky. She had a charm that could disarm anyone, and she used it to her advantage. But there was always something about Regina that I couldn't put my finger on. A darkness, maybe. I ignored it, convincing myself that we were just different. My relationship with Johnny started out like something from a fairy tale. He was the kind of guy you dreamed about when you were a little girl. Handsome, successful, and completely devoted, at least in the beginning. We met through mutual friends at a party, and from that moment, it felt like everything clicked. He was charming, always saying the right things, doing the right things. I fell hard and fast. Johnny had his own complicated family dynamic. He was the youngest of 3 brothers, all of whom seemed to worship the ground he walked on. His mother, Jean, adored him, and his father, Rick, was the strong, silent type. Johnny grew up with privilege, but he wasn't spoiled. At least, not in the way you'd think. He knew how to charm people, how to get what he wanted without ever seeming like he was asking for it. It was a talent, one I admired back then. Before we got married, everything felt perfect. My family adored Johnny, especially Becky and Regina. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs. Becky was always a little too flirty around him, and Regina, well, Regina had a way of getting what she wanted without ever asking. But I was blinded by love, convinced that Johnny and I were meant to be. Our wedding was a dream. Every detail, from the flowers to the cake, was meticulously planned. We exchanged vows in a small chapel in the countryside, surrounded by friends and family. Becky was my maid of honor, and Regina was one of my bridesmaids. I remember the way Johnny looked at me that day, like I was the only woman in the world. It was magical, and for a while, our marriage felt like a continuation of that dream. The first few years were blissful. Johnny and I moved into a beautiful house, and I thought we were building a life together. We had our share of ups and downs, like any couple, but nothing that ever made me question our relationship. He was attentive, loving, and always made time for me. I felt secure in our marriage, in the life we had built. But things started to change around year 3. Johnny became more distant, spending late nights at work or out with his friends. I chalked it up to stress, to the demands of his job. He was in real estate, and business was booming, so I told myself that the long hours were just part of the territory. But there was something off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Becky had moved back to town around that time. She'd been living in New York, supposedly working for some big financial firm, but she never talked much about her job. I didn't question it. After all, she was my sister, and I trusted her. Regina, too, had become a more constant presence in our lives. She had always been around, but now it seemed like she was always dropping by unannounced, always finding excuses to be near Johnny. Again, I ignored it. I trusted them both. The cracks in our marriage began to show during the 4th year. Johnny was more secretive, and I started to feel like I was losing him. We argued more, usually about small things that shouldn't have mattered. I tried to convince myself that it was just a rough patch, that all marriages went through phases like this. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to admit it. Then, one night, everything changed. Johnny came home late, reeking of perfume that wasn't mine. I confronted him, but he brushed it off, saying it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I started paying closer attention, looking for signs of what I didn't want to believe. That's when I found the text messages. I remember the night it all came crashing down as if it happened yesterday. Johnny had been coming home later than usual, his excuses becoming more flimsy with each passing week. He'd say he was working late or out with clients, but there was something off in his eyes, a guilty flicker he couldn't hide. Still, I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was all in my head. After all, we'd been married for 5 years, and he had always been a good husband, or so I thought. That night, though, something shifted. Johnny came home after midnight, his shirt wrinkled and the faintest trace of perfume lingering in the air. But it wasn't my perfume. My heart sank, and every fiber of my being told me something was terribly wrong. He tried to slink into bed without a word, but I couldn't let it go. "Johnny, where were you?" I asked, my voice tight, trying not to sound accusatory. "Work dinner," he replied without looking at me, already pulling the sheets over himself. But that scent. It wasn't from any restaurant. I knew it wasn't the kind of perfume you'd smell at a business dinner. It was too floral, too intimate. My mind raced, piecing together the late nights, the evasiveness, the sudden change in his demeanor. I let it slide that night, telling myself I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my world was about to fall apart. The next day, while Johnny was at work, I decided to do something I never thought I'd resort to. I checked his phone. It felt wrong, but I had to know. My heart raced as I scrolled through his messages, searching for anything that would explain the growing distance between us. And then I found it. A text message from Becky. It started innocently enough, flirty exchanges, jokes, the kind of teasing I might have expected between a brother-in-law and sister-in-law. But then it got darker. The messages became more intimate, more sexual. I felt my stomach drop as I read them, each word a stab to my heart. They had been seeing each other behind my back for months, maybe even longer. And Becky, my own sister, was the one who had initiated it. I couldn't breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. How could they do this to me? How could my sister betray me like this? But the nightmare didn't end there. As I kept scrolling, another name caught my eye, Regina. My cousin. I felt sick as I opened the message thread between her and Johnny. It was worse than I could have ever imagined. Not only had Johnny been sleeping with Becky, but he had also been involved with Regina for even longer. The details were vile. Johnny had been sneaking around with both of them, sometimes even on the same night. There were messages about secret meetups at hotels, at our own family gatherings, and, worst of all, in our home when I wasn't there. I felt like my entire life had been a lie, like the man I thought I knew was someone completely different. But the final blow came when I found out that Regina's child, the baby she had always claimed was fathered by some mysterious man she had a brief fling with, was actually Johnny's. I confronted Johnny that same night. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I stormed into the living room where he was casually watching TV, completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I threw his phone at him, and the look on his face when he realized what I had seen was one of pure panic. "Is this real, Johnny? Are you really sleeping with Becky and Regina?" My voice trembled with rage, the pain I had kept inside boiling over. He didn't even try to deny it. He just sat there, staring at me, his mouth opening and closing like he was struggling to find the right words. "Cass, don't you dare cast me," I screamed. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been betraying me with my sister and cousin?" He rubbed his face, finally managing to mutter, "It's complicated." Complicated. That's what he called it. Like cheating with two of the people closest to me could be boiled down to a mere complication. I couldn't believe the audacity. I wanted to hit him, to scream until I couldn't anymore, but I just stood there, tears streaming down my face, feeling utterly destroyed. But Johnny wasn't the only one who needed to answer for this. I confronted Becky the next day. I called her and told her we needed to talk. She sounded hesitant, but she agreed to meet at a cafe, as if she didn't already know what was coming. When I arrived, she was sitting at a corner table, looking nervous. The moment I sat down, I didn't even give her a chance to speak. "How could you do this to me? How could you sleep with my husband?" Becky's eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then her face crumpled, and she started to cry. "Cass, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You've been having an affair with my husband for months. How is that an accident?" She wiped at her eyes, trying to play the victim, but I wasn't buying it. I was lonely, okay? I missed you, and Johnny was there. I didn't plan for it to happen. I stood up, unable to listen to any more of her pathetic excuses. "You're disgusting, Becky. You're not my sister anymore." But Becky wasn't the only one who had to face the consequences. Regina was next on my list. I confronted her at her home, knocking on her door with a fury I had never felt before. When she opened it, holding her baby in her arms, she looked surprised to see me. But I wasn't there to play nice. "I know Johnny's the father of your baby, Regina. How long have you been lying to me?" She didn't even flinch. "What does it matter, Cassaundra? You have no idea what Johnny and I had before you ever came into the picture." Her coldness stunned me. "Before I came into the picture? He's my husband, Regina. He's not yours." She shrugged, a smug smile creeping across her face. "He's always been mine, whether you want to admit it or not." I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I'd ever experienced. How could she be so callous, so completely unrepentant? But instead of hitting her or screaming, I just turned and walked away. I knew then that revenge wasn't something I could take in the heat of a moment. I needed to be smart, to make them all pay in a way they'd never see coming. The divorce was a messy, drawn-out affair. Johnny tried to act like he was remorseful, like he wanted to make things right, but I knew it was all an act. He didn't care about me or our marriage, he only cared about saving face. Becky fled town shortly after our confrontation, but not because of the affair. No, it turned out she had been running from something else, a warrant for her arrest. She had been involved in an embezzlement scheme at her job in New York, and the law had finally caught up with her. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction knowing that she wasn't just losing me, but her freedom as well. But the real revenge? That came later. I knew Johnny's real estate business was everything to him. It was his pride, his source of power, and I was going to take it from him. I reached out to a friend of mine who worked in finance, someone who had inside knowledge of Johnny's shady business dealings. With a few carefully leaked documents and the right connections, it wasn't long before the authorities were investigating him for fraud. Johnny's empire crumbled overnight. His assets were frozen, his business partners abandoned him, and he was left scrambling to pick up the pieces. Regina, who had hitched her wagon to his success, suddenly found herself tied to a man with nothing left. The life she thought she was building with him was gone, and so was the security she had counted on. And me? I walked away from it all. I got everything I wanted in the divorce: our house, the car, and the satisfaction of knowing that Johnny, Becky, and Regina would never be able to hurt me again. I rebuilt my life, piece by piece, stronger and more resilient than ever before. In the end, I realized that revenge wasn't about destroying them, it was about reclaiming my own power. They thought they could break me, but I rose from the ashes of their betrayal, fiercer than ever. And as for Johnny, Becky, and Regina? They'll always have to live with the knowledge that they lost everything, not because of what they did to me, but because of the choices they made. As I look back on it all, I'm no longer angry. I'm free. And that's the best revenge I could have ever imagined.
So everybody, what are your thoughts about this video? Jot your opinions down below in the comments. If you like the video, please give me a thumbs up. And again, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell for more videos. Until next time, ciao. Don't forget, check out this video next. Go ahead, right now.